Okay, in this next chunk, we want to give our code the ability to invite and to receive invitation messages and to change the button presentation in response. Before we do that, we first need to tackle one bug that was in the code, and that is in main.js. So public.js main, this is in the client code. What we'll find is we will find that there's one problem in the message when we're disconnecting. If you go down to the player disconnected event, we said that if something exists, then we should make them disappear. So what this means is when a player disconnects, we want their row to go away. But unfortunately, that means that would be if this is not equal to 0. So we want to make that not equal to 0. All right, so then we can save that. Okay, the next thing that we want to do is we now want to add the ability to invite people. Well, what does that mean? That means that when this button shows up, when a person enters the lobby that says invite, we want it to actually be able to do something. So when we click on that button, we want to call a function in our main client that will send a message to the server asking us to invite someone else. All right, well, to do that, we're going to need some kind of a function in our code that will do the inviting. And so to do the inviting, we'll go up and maybe put a function right after our disconnect. So here's our disconnect. Let's just make a little helpful function for ourselves called invite, and it'll pass it the who that we want to invite, and that'll be a socket, a socket ID of the person that we want to invite. And what we're going to do is we're just going to send a message to the server. So we'll give it a payload, and we'll say the payload.socket, or rather we'll call it requested user, will be equal to who. So that gives us our payload, and then we'll just write a little log message. It says console log, single quote, client log message, single quote, escaped, invite, single quote, escaped, and the payload is the JSON stringified payload. All right, so that'll just be output on the browser console so that we know that we successfully hit the invite button. And then finally, we just want to say socket.emit. We need to give it the message that we're sending, and it'll be invite, and we'll send it the payload. And that should do all the work that we need in order to invite someone. Now, once you invite someone, you've got to handle the response that you get back, and so that's going to be an invite response, message back. So I'm just going to copy this send message response for the basic structure, and I'm going to, instead of it being the send message response, when we get something back from the server, it's going to be the invite response. And as long as the payload didn't indicate that it failed, then what we will do is we want to change the button that we had. And so we currently had an invite button, and we want to shift it to an invited button. So we're going to make a new node, and we're going to have to make another helper function, which is make invited button. And once we have it, we want to put it in the right place, and the place we're going to put it is we're going to find the object, which has a class of dot, or you find it using the dot, but the class is socket underscore plus payload.socket underscore ID, and then we want to find a button which is underneath it, which exists in the DOM underneath it. And if we find such a button, then we want to replace it with our new node. And we'll get rid of this message that's left over from send message. So when we get a message back from the server saying that our invited response was successful, we'll make an invited button, and we will replace the existing button, which should be invite, with it. So it'll kind of look like the button changes when we do that. Likewise, if we didn't get an invited response, but instead we just out of the blue get some sort of message that we have been invited generally, so this isn't in response to us hitting a button, but it's in response to someone else inviting us, we'll again check to make sure that the payload didn't fail, and instead of making an invited button, we'll go ahead and make a play button. Okay, and we'll replace that with the new node. So that is going to handle the invite. So let's now go and make these new buttons for ourselves. We need an invited button and we need a play button. So let's get those. We'll go down to where they already exist. Let's see, where do we do it? There's make invite button, and we will just build a new one. So copy make invite button, and we'll say make an invited button, and instead of it saying invite, it'll say invited, and instead of it being an outline, it'll be filled in blue. Okay, great. And we will make a play button. So if someone invites us, we will make it say play. And instead of using the primary button, we will use the success button. All right, and as long as we're making buttons, we know we're going to later need a button when just for a brief moment before everyone plays the game. So this will be an engaged button. This is when two people hit, one person hits invite and the other person hits play in response. And we'll make that a danger button. Okay, so that's good. So what's going to happen now? Someone enters the lobby. We get that message that they enter the lobby. We build a row for them. When we build the row, we make an invite button. When we make that invite button, it'll get put up on the display. When we click on that button, what's going to happen? Well, right now, nothing, because our invite button doesn't actually have the capacity to do anything. It's just a button, it's just a UI bit, but it doesn't actually invoke any action. So what we want to do is we want to add something that happens when we click on it. So after in the invite button, we're going to go ahead and add a click function. And what's going to happen when we click on it is a function, and we are just going to, let's see, the invite button, if we click on the invite button, is going to invite who? Who are we going to invite? Well, we're going to invite someone with a socket ID, but we don't have such a socket ID, so we'll have to change it so that our make invite button receives a socket ID. All right, so we will construct a new button so that a player is invited. Okay. Let's go to where we called make invite button here, and we're going to have to say, well, who do we want to invite in this case? And we'll have to pass it the payload.socket_ID and the join room response. And down here, we'll have to do the same thing. And anywhere else we call make invite button. All right, so if we test this, then what we should see is when someone enters the room, we'll get a button. The button will be constructed, and we will be able to click on it. When we click on it, we're going to call the invite function. The invite function is then going to call the server. The server will then process that and respond with the invited response and the invited message. And then when our clients receive those messages back from the server, it will make a new invited button and a new play button. So that's good for main.js. Now let's go take a look at server.js and make sure that it can handle these events of invite, just the event of invite. Okay, I want to make one correction, which is here on the socket response. I don't want it to be invited response. I want it to be invite response, because we say invite here and we get back an invite response. All right, so I'm going to save that, and next I'm going to look at server.js. And in server.js, I am interested in going to, let's see, we'll go, here's the send message command. And I think what we'll do is we'll copy the send message command here. And we're going to paste it right after the existing send message command. And then we're going to start editing it to handle the invite message. So what we're going to have is we're going to have the invite command. This is what happens when the client talks to the server and says invite. And the payload for this is just going to be the requested user. And so this is the socket ID of the person to be invited, and there's no message, and the response will be result success, and it'll be the socket underscore ID. It'll be the socket ID of the person being invited, if all goes well. Otherwise, it'll just be a fail and a failure message. And then the other thing, though, is that not only do you get an invite response, so let's see, this is not a send message response, it's an invite response. But in addition to that, you can also get a message that says invited. And this is if you didn't initiate, but someone else initiated. And the result is going to be exactly the same, or the content is going to be exactly the same. All right, so the message that the server receives is invite, and we have the payload, and we're not going to say server received the command send message, we are just going to say invite with, and then we want single quote plus JSON dot stringify the payload. All right, and then like before, we will just check to make sure that a payload was sent. And this is going to be the same as the previous command. We just need to make sure it doesn't say send message. Let's see, socket on not invited, socket on invite. Make sure that says invite. Invite had no payload and fail, and then this is an invite response. Okay, then when we don't care about the, let's see, what are we getting? We're just getting that, and then we're getting the requested user. But what we're going to get is we're going to get the, let's see, we're going to need a username. We're going to need a room. No, what we'll do is not yet. We'll get the username, but the username is not going to be from the payload. The username is going to come from players. It's going to come from socket.id.username. So we'll just look up the username in our data reference. And let's see, I guess, so what are we doing? We're check that the message can be traced to a username. So this is figuring out who sent the username of the person who's doing the inviting. And we will say that invite didn't specify username. No, that's not quite right. Invite can't identify who sent the message. Make sure we escape that apostrophe and the can't. And then this is an invite response. Okay, I see that I have a typo in this invite response. Okay. So now we have a payload, and we have identified a username, and now let's get the requested user from the payload. And if the requested user, let's see, and then we'll say the invite didn't specify requested user, command aborted, and then this is the invite response and invite response message back. All right. And then finally, we need to get some room data, and so we are going to say that the room is going to equal to players, and we'll get it with the socket.id.room. So that's the reference to the data structure we have that's keeping track of where the players are and the room that they're in. And we are interested in the room object that we can get. So we know everyone, we have details about who is in the room that we're inviting people to. And that's adapter.room subroom. All right, and then we need to make sure the user being invited is in the room. We're going to do that by saying if room object.sockets. So if any of the players that are connected in the room, looking at them by the sockets, has own property. So if any of the sockets look like the requested user, then they are in the room. Okay. And then we will, let's say, I guess if we'll do this as an error message. So if that doesn't exist, then we'll copy an error message down here. And we'll say the error message is that invite requested a user that wasn't in the room. And we will say command aborted. And make sure that apostrophe is escaped and that is invite response, and we'll send that out. But basically, if we get to here, then we know that all of the data that got sent by the client is okay. So we'll just say if everything is okay, respond to the inviter that it was successful. And what does a successful response look like? Well, success data, the result was success, and the socket underscore ID is the socket was actually the requested user. Okay, and then we are just going to send that back to the person who requested to be invited. So socket admit invite response, and we will send them the success data. All right, and then we will tell the invitee that they have been invited. And it'll be a similar kind of message here. We will create a success packet, and we'll say success, but in this case, the person that's being invited is the person who initiated this response. And this is not the invited message, this is the invite response, this is the invited message. And we are going to not send it back to the user, we're going to send it to the requested user. We're going to emit that signal invited. Great. And then we will log that invite successful. Okay, if everything went well, we should have enough to do basic invitations. That means that we should be able to click the button and have the button switch one way. So let's see if this compiles, and we'll go from there. Say node server.js. Looks good. Then let's try out our test. So Don enters the room, and Bizarro enters the room, and our player is going to show up. Oh, there's a syntax error in main.js in line 191. So let's take a look at that. All right. Line 191 in main, what do we see? We tried to add a new click function, and we forgot to add a parenthesis and a semicolon after that. Okay, so the make invite button was missing a parenthesis and a semicolon. Come back here, and I will try that again. And I saw that down in the console of my server, of my browser. So I'll have Don enter the room, and have Bizarro enter the room. And great, and Bizarro and Don are there. And now if I hit the invite button, we should see both buttons change. Great, perfect. That's how far we want to get in this coding demo. If we go back and do it the other way, we should see the same effect, but in reverse. Good, and then if this player leaves, we should see this Bizarro disappear on the left. Great, and then come back. And then play. Super. Okay, so we'll stop this coding session at this point. Thank you for your attention.